You probably imagine the vicious Bloody Mary or the magnificent Elizabeth I when you think of Henry VIII's children. Both of these women were extremely powerful. Nevertheless, there was another child, Edward VI, the boy king, whose brief reign would show a darkness that even his infamous father might have found frightening. This youngster would go on to become the monarch. The person who gained the throne when he was 9 years old would go from being a child who appeared to be innocent to becoming one of the most authoritarian rulers in England before reaching an end that was so twisted that it would forever haunt the Tudor dynasty. A sick boy who passes away at a young age is not the only subject of the narrative that you're going to hear. Rather, it is about how total power can corrupt absolutely, even when it is in the hands of a child. Everything that you believed you understood about the Tudor legacy will be called into question by the information that you will uncover concerning Edward's final days. It was the year 1537, and Henry VIII had at long last obtained what he had been working so hard to achieve, a legitimate male heir. The birth of Edward was heralded all over England as the solution to decades of dynastic instability. Nonetheless, his coming came at a tremendous cost to the country. Only 12 days after giving birth, his mother, Jane Seymour, passed away, leaving the young prince without a mother. This made him even more important to his father, who was becoming increasingly paranoid during this time. Edward was not treated as a kid, but rather as England's future savior from the very beginning of his life. He was surrounded by guards, teachers, and courtiers who continually reminded him of his heavenly destiny. As a result of this separation from the typical experiences of childhood, the first step in the development of a monster would be taken. In contrast to his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had both been subjected to the wrath and rejection of their father, Edward had only ever known gratitude and admiration from his father. Henry VIII likely felt guilty about the way he had treated his daughters, and as a result, he lavished his son with an amount of attention and affection that was so intense that it bordered on idolatry. Despite the fact that the young prince was provided with the best tutors that money could buy, these were not your typical professors. Rather, they were radical Protestant theologians who were selected explicitly for the purpose of shaping Edward into the ideal conservative monarch. Edward began his education at the age of 6, studying not just Latin and Greek, but also extensive theological treatises about the sins of Catholicism and the divine right of Protestant rulers to rule without limitation. Rather than being an educational experience, the schooling that Henry VIII devised for his son was more akin to indoctrination. John Cheek, Edward's primary tutor, was a great scholar, but also a religious enthusiast. He filled the boy's head with ideas of England as a new Jerusalem, cleansed of Catholic corruption. It was around this time that Edward was exposed to religion. All of the lessons, whether they were about history, philosophy, or statecraft, were viewed through the lens of the absolute authority of the royal family and the Protestant supremacy. By the time Edward was 8 years old, he was able to recite intricate theological justifications for why Catholics deserved to be put to death and why any opposition to his future rule would be equivalent to resisting God himself. Edward's upbringing was exceptionally risky because it coupled academic sophistication with utter emotional isolation. This combination made Edward's upbringing particularly perilous. Not only was he capable of engaging in theological discourse with university professors, but he had never engaged in play with other children or encountered regular human connections. His only associates were grown-ups who treated him with deference. This resulted in the creation of a youngster who was capable of comprehending intricate political theory but lacked an understanding of human empathy or the significance of individual existence. His future reign would be characterized by every facet of his life due to the toxic combination of his exceptional intelligence and emotional stunting. During the fall of 1547, England was ruled by a young boy of 9 years old who had been brought up to think that he was God's chosen instrument on earth. After the death of his father, Henry VIII, Edward VI ascended to the throne, inheriting not just a crown, but also a kingdom that had been torn apart by religious unrest. He had been shaped by the most extreme Protestant tutors that his father could find, persons who filled his brain with ideas of religious purity and ultimate authority. The young king had been shaped by these guys. In contrast to his older sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had witnessed their father's rage directly, Edward had been protected, lauded, and assured from birth that he was destined for greatness. Mary and Elizabeth had experienced all of these things firsthand. It was a combination of supernatural authority and infantile petulance that would prove to be fatal for many of his subjects. The religious tension in England was a powder keg, and Edward inherited it as his inheritance. Despite the fact that his father had severed ties with Rome and formed the Church of England, the nation continued to be fractured along religious lines, with Catholics, moderate Protestants, and radical reformers all holding opposing views. At first glance, it appeared as though Edward's Regency Council, which was now being directed by his uncle Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, would provide moderate administration. Nevertheless, the young king had his own thoughts regarding the manner in which England was to be governed. Edward displayed an uncomfortable blend of infantile petulance and cool calculation from the very beginning of his council meetings. He would interrupt seasoned council in order to teach them about Protestant doctrine. Those who were present at the time were surprised by how swiftly the young monarch, who was just 9 years old, began to exert his authority. Within a few short weeks following his coronation, Edward began personally evaluating individual death sentences and displaying an unsettling eagerness for the execution of individuals whom he considered to be heretical. A child who debated the theological arguments for various punishments with the same level of detachment that he might analyze Latin grammar is revealed in court records from this time period. The child addressed questions of life and death as if they were intellectual exercises. It was said by witnesses that Edward would frequently smile when signing death warrants. It was evident that he was pleased with his own ingenuity in locating scriptural justification for each execution. The first few months of the young king's reign were characterized by behavior that courtiers referred to in private as religious tantrums. These were violent outbursts of wrath that occurred whenever anyone recommended moderation in religious policy. Edward was so engrossed in the teachings of his teacher that he was convinced that any deviation from the norms of the Catholic Church would constitute a personal betrayal of those who followed Christ. It is said that Edward hurled his inkwell at his advisor and yelled that God would punish England for such a lack of strength when the advisor urged that some Catholic nobles should be allowed to maintain their private prayer. These instances were previously disregarded as unimportant. On the basis of Edward's childlike behavior, it was clear that he was developing into a very dangerous religious zealot. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his behavior was the apparent absence of typical juvenile interests. During the time that other children his age were playing with toys, Edward spent his free time reading accounts of the Spanish Inquisition and taking thorough notes on the procedures that were used to interrogate people. According to his personal attendants, they discovered drawings in his chamber that depicted various kinds of torture. These drawings were annotated with Edward's remarks on how efficient these methods were for eliciting confessions from heretics. When he should have been learning how to ride horses, the young kid instead focused his attention on researching the most effective methods of breaking human bodies and spirits in order to fulfill his Protestant ideal. Edward's blend of religious fanaticism and royal authority was what made him a particularly dangerous individual. During the time when his advisors were plotting and scheming about him, the Kid King did his best to learn everything there was to know about the divine right of monarchs with chilling enthusiasm. During his reign, he kept comprehensive notebooks, and these materials portray a youngster who took great pleasure in describing the agony of those he considered to be heretics, as well as executions and religious persecutions. By the time he was 10 years old, Edward had already begun personally preparing sermons that were given in churches all over England. These sermons demanded the complete removal of Catholic influence and predicted divine wrath for anyone who showed pity to heretics. The young king's ruthless behavior was not confined to things pertaining to religion. The vengeful nature that Edward displayed was so shocking that even the most seasoned courtiers who had served Edward's cruel father were taken aback. Edward would construct complex punishments for his subordinates if they dissatisfied him. These punishments appeared to be devised more to embarrass himself than to correct their behavior. The poor page who accidentally spilled wine on Edward's papers was made to stand in the courtyard for several hours as courtiers hurled bad food at him. All of this was done in the direction of the 11-year-old king. Edward watched these humiliations with a clear sense of delight, frequently taking notes on the victims' reactions as if he were performing experiments for a scientific study. The writings that were written in the Boy King's journal during this time period reflect a mind that was getting increasingly distanced from the typical human emotions. Edward wrote about the sorrows of other people with the same clinical detachment that he used to describe the weather. He noted the specifics of pain and anxiety as intriguing observations rather than as tragedies. The young king's only documented comment was that the correction proved to be more efficient than anticipated in removing the subject from future error. This was in response to the fact that a kitchen maid had died after being beaten on Edward's orders for purportedly reciting Catholic prayers. Although Edward's treatment of his own family was likely the clearest indicator of his rising sociopathy, it was not the only indication. At the time of his accession to the throne, Edward did not exhibit any natural affinity for Mary or Elizabeth, despite the fact that he had been raised with his sisters during his early childhood. The alternative was that he regarded them through the same religious lens that he used to examine all of his subjects. Mary posed a hazardous threat. Elizabeth was a prospective ally who had Protestant sympathies, which made her marginally more acceptable. Elizabeth was a Catholic who needed to be controlled or murdered when she was a potential ally. For Edward, the ties among his family were nothing more than political calculations. When Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, attempted to gain influence over him through gifts and flattery, the metamorphosis became even more visible than it had been before. Rather than being seduced by kindness, Edward interpreted Thomas's advances as attempts to control him, and he answered with a cold calculation. Edward was not only in favor of Thomas's death when he was arrested on charges of treason, but he also apparently watched from his window as the man who had been good to him in the past was dragged to the gallows. During the time that the axe was falling, witnesses stated that the Kid King did not exhibit any signs of emotion. Instead, he was using his journal to make notes regarding the effectiveness of various ways of execution. The authoritarian inclinations that Edward exhibited became significantly more pronounced when he approached his 12th year. The young man who had before appeared feeble and bookish started exercising direct control over the policies of the administration, frequently going against the advice of his advisors when he believed they were being too lenient. His Protestant reforms became increasingly repressive, with networks of informants enforcing mandatory church attendance and heavy punishments for any divergence from authorized orthodoxy. His policies were directed against the Protestant reform movement. Children were paid for reporting their parents' religious offenses, and Edward personally developed a system of religious surveillance that would have made the Spanish Inquisition happy. Neighbors were encouraged to spy on neighbors, and children were rewarded for reporting transgressions committed by their parents. Because of the king's fixation with control, every facet of religious life in England was subject to his authority. Edward provided extensive regulations that governed not just public worship, but also private devotions. He did this by defining exactly how his subjects should pray, what they should believe, and even how they should think about God. The violation of these restrictions was considered treason against both the monarch and the divinity, and the consequent sanctions ranged from public humiliation to jail to death. The Boy King personally examined each and every case, and he frequently increased the punishments that were prescribed because he believed that the initial sentencing lacked sufficient enthusiasm for the purity of the Protestant religion. Edward established what were effectively thought police, which encouraged subjects to report on the religious practices of their neighbors and offered rewards for successful denunciations. The young king took great joy in reading these reports, and he frequently called the accusers before the court to provide additional information on the alleged wrongdoings of their neighbors. Those who were found guilty of having Catholic sympathies risked the possibility of being imprisoned, tortured, or even put to death. The young king himself reviewed the prescribed punishments and quite frequently increased them. The court of Edward became a place where extremism and paranoia were rewarded, and mercy was regarded as a sign of weakness from the people. Both the methodical structure of the apparatus of persecution that Edward devised and the fact that the monarch was personally involved in its functioning made it a remarkable piece of equipment, in contrast to adult commanders who might assign such responsibilities. Edward insisted on personally scrutinizing each and every case, analyzing the specifics of each accused person's claimed offenses, and frequently coming up with distinctive punishments that were customized to what he perceived to be the precise theological errors that each accused person had committed. The writings that he kept during this time period read like an instruction manual for the persecution of religious groups. They were full of in-depth debates about the punishments that were most effective for various sorts of heresy. There was something about Edward's persecution that was particularly unsettling, and that was the way he mixed childlike imagination with very serious aim. The youthful king would constantly justify his new forms of humiliation and misery by presenting intricate theological justifications. When traditional types of punishment appeared to be insufficient, he would devise new forms of punishment. Edward was the target of children throwing stones at a Catholic priest who refused to renounce his faith. The priest was forced to carry a sign that read, "Enemy of Christ," around the streets of London while children threw stones at him. This event was purportedly witnessed by the monarch from the window of his palace, where he was reportedly laughing at the misery of the priest while dictating observations to his secretary. The king's fixation with religious purity extended to his own family in ways that exposed his complete lack of natural affection for his family members. Although Mary, Edward's half-sister, was a fervent Catholic, he did not consider her to be a member of his family, but rather the biggest danger to his Protestant England. Edward talked about Mary with a loathing that was both childish and scary in private letters that remained. He referred to her as the bastard and Christ's enemy, while devising ways to have her declared illegitimate or perhaps executed for heresy. These letters were written in private and were preserved. On the contrary, the young man who ought to have experienced feelings of brotherly affection instead had thoughts of witnessing his sister being burned at the stake for her religious views. Edward's hate of Mary went beyond a simple political calculation. It seemed to devour him with a personal intensity that even his most radical advisors were concerned about. Through consultation with Protestant attorneys who were all too happy to create legal grounds for what amounted to fratricide, the young king spent a significant amount of time conceiving up situations in which he could legally remove Mary from the succession. Observers of the court remarked that Edward's disposition would become more gloomy whenever Mary's name was brought up, and he would frequently go to his rooms in order to compose lengthy screeds about the religious need of removing her from the line of succession. The plans that the child king had for dealing with Mary became more and more intricate and ruthless as time went on. Including precise charges of heresy and treason, Edward devised detailed scenarios for Mary's capture, trial, and execution. These scenarios included these particular charges. Before being awarded the compassion of a fast death by beheading rather than burning, he even composed what he believed to be Mary's confession. He forced her to reject Catholicism and accept that she was born into an illegitimate family. These documents, which have been preserved in the royal archives, shed light on a mentality that had gone beyond the concept of typical political competition and had instead developed true psychopathic hatred. The manner in which Edward dealt with Elizabeth was more complicated, but it was just as unsettling, despite the fact that he supported her Protestantism. In contrast to his image of his younger sister as a member of his family, Edward primarily regarded her as a good instrument for his religious cause. When compared to the potential political benefits that Elizabeth's marriage could bring to his cause, he considered her future happiness to be of little consequence. He intended to utilize Elizabeth's prospective marriage as a means of establishing an alliance with Protestants. Even his reasonably pleasant thoughts toward Elizabeth were filtered through his religious obsessions, which made it quite evident that the value that he placed on his sister was solely instrumental. The inability of the monarch to establish normal familial ties extended to his court as a whole as well. Edward did not take his nobles, advisors, and servants into consideration as individuals who have their own value. Rather, he regarded them as pieces on a chessboard that might be moved in accordance with his theological and political ideas. In the event that they did not demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for his more radical ideas, those who had faithfully served him for years could find themselves excluded from his service or perhaps put to death. Complete surrender to Edward's vision of Protestant England was required for loyalty to him. There was no room for personal conscience or moral concerns with regard to this goal. At the beginning of the year 1553, Edward began exhibiting symptoms of a terrible sickness, which resulted in his behavior becoming even more irregular and vicious. Instead of being more pliable in the face of his own mortality, the young king, who was just 15 years old at the time, became consumed with making sure that his Protestant reforms would endure after his death. He was aware that Mary's Ascension would result in the revival of Catholicism, and it was this awareness that compelled him to take increasingly desperate actions. Edward's wrath was so intense that it bordered on insanity, and it caused him to consider potential solutions that would have shocked even his authoritarian father. The prospect that his Catholic sister would erase the work that he had done throughout his life filled Edward with rage. There was a clear indication that the young king's deteriorating health served to exacerbate rather than mitigate his radicalism. In spite of the fact that Edward's physical health was deteriorating, his religious zeal became even more intense. It was as though he was attempting to squeeze a lifetime of Protestant cleansing into the few months that he had left. It was claimed by court physicians that the king's illness was accompanied by bouts of fevered preaching. During these intervals, the king would offer rambling sermons about the necessity of eliminating Catholic influence, even if it meant killing every Catholic in England. In the beginning, these rants were thought to be the result of delirium. But when Edward experienced periods of clarity, it became clear that his harsh utterances were not the result of sickness-induced ravings, but rather genuine intents. Edward started holding clandestine meetings with fanatics of the Protestant faith in order to arrange a revolt that would circumvent both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. The scheme that was revealed was astounding in its daring and cruelty. It involved intentions to either arrest or kill both of his sisters, as well as preparations to construct a puppet regime that would be governed by followers of the Protestant faith. In spite of the fact that he was physically weak, the monarch, who was just 15 years old, pushed himself into these planning sessions with an enthusiasm that both astounded and alarmed his fellow conspirators. It was discovered that Edward had undergone a complete makeover as the facts of his final plot were revealed. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was Edward's employer. Edward was the child of a father who aspired to rule as a dictator. Edward devised a scheme that would have led to the execution of both of his sisters and the establishment of a Protestant government that was more radical than anything that England had ever seen before. Among the provisions of the conspiracy were plans for the mass execution of Catholic nobility, the confiscation of all Catholic possessions, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force that would monitor every element of English life. On a personal level, Edward was involved in the planning of these atrocities, and his involvement was specific and enthusiastic. In the final weeks of his life, the dying monarch spent his time devising lists of Catholics who were to be executed, properties that were to be taken, and laws that were to be implemented in his Protestant paradise. The condition that he was suffering from caused his handwriting to become increasingly unsteady, and he filled page after page with preparations for what amounted to religious extermination. Once upon a time, the young kid who appeared to be a helpless victim of political manipulation showed himself to be the driving force behind a plot that, in comparison, would have made the Spanish Inquisition appear to be more kind. The illness that Edward was suffering from, however, had a horrible twist that appeared to be divine punishment for the crimes that he had plotted. A contemporary medical analysis reveals that the young king suffered from a mix of tuberculosis and what was most certainly arsenic poisoning. It is possible that his own physicians administered arsenic poisoning to him in an attempt to heal his ailment, but did so in an incorrect manner. The irony was not missed on those who were living during that time period. The monarch who had poisoned England with religious hatred was now being slowly poisoned by the very individuals who were attempting to save his life. Edward suffered from hallucinations and moments of madness, which his courtiers understood as religious visions. These hallucinations and times of madness occurred as the poisons gradually killed his body. The young man who had given no mercy to others endured excruciating suffering throughout his final weeks of life, his body racked with misery as he gradually withdrew from life, as if his physical torture was feeding his mental obsessions rather than cleansing them. The court medics observed that Edward's suffering appeared to intensify his religious fervor rather than providing any spiritual solace. This indicates that Edward's suffering was not providing any spiritual comfort. Particularly horrific for those who were present during Edward's passing was the manner in which he passed away. The young king's body began to emanate a foul odor many weeks before to his death, and his complexion took on a greenish tinge that signaled acute poisoning. This was noted by the court physicians. Edward experienced strong convulsions that temporarily rendered him paralyzed, and his hair and fingernails started falling out. Both of these symptoms occurred simultaneously. While his body appeared to be fighting against the poison that was killing him, the youngster who had once been regarded as one of the most attractive of Henry VIII's offspring deteriorated into an ugly shell of his former self. During his dying days, the king spent his time alternating between shrieks of physical agony and fevered rants about Protestant martyrs. This was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. The monarch remained conscious enough to realize what was happening to him. The majority of Edward's most recent cogent conversations were not about forgiveness or reconciliation. Rather, they were about his. The dying monarch asked his conspirators to continue with their conspiracy, even without him, promising them that God would reward their faithfulness in constructing his Protestant paradise. He was saddened by the fact that he would not survive to see his intended purifying of England through to completion. The final hours of the young king's life were a bizarre caricature of a scene found on a deathbed. Edward spent his final breath denouncing his Catholic sister and pleading to God to protect Protestant England from what he referred to as Mary's wickedness. On the other hand, he did not seek forgiveness or express his love for his family. It was a fitting conclusion to a life that had been consumed by religious fanaticism and political extremism due to the fact that his dying words were not words of peace, but rather words of hatred, as stated by witnesses. On July 6, 1553, Edward passed away, and his courtiers were filled with a palpable sense of relief. Nevertheless, very few of them dared to express their feelings in public. The Kid King, who had promised to be England's rescue, had instead become the country's nightmare, and his death offered the only escape from policies that were becoming increasingly radical and driving the kingdom towards civil war. Although they would never have revealed such sentiments in public, even his most dedicated supporters privately realized that Edward's death might have been a mercy for England. However, they would never disclose such ideas to the public. In the early aftermath of Edward's passing, it became clear how completely his meticulously planned plans had been constructed on the basis of his own personal authority. It only took a few days for the conspiracy to fall apart, because moderate Protestants abandoned what they now understood to be an extremist plot. This was because the king's will was not behind the conspiracy. Lady Jane Grey, who was supposed to be the benefactor of Edward's coup, found herself in a position where she had absolutely no friends. Nobles who had appeared to be loyal to the Protestant cause suddenly discovered that they had urgent business elsewhere. Mary's successful claim to the throne was supported not just by traditionalist Catholics, but also by moderate Protestants who were terrified by what Edward's reign had revealed about the possibility for religious radicalism. Mary's claim to the throne was successful. To ensure that his reign would be remembered mostly for its cruelty and the relief that followed his death, the boy king, who had dreamed of becoming England's greatest Protestant champion, had instead made certain that his reign would be remembered mostly for its cruelty. Even devoted members of the Protestant faith found themselves accepting Catholic Mary as a more desirable alternative to the ongoing control of fanatics of the Protestant faith. In addition to his failed succession plans, the irony of Edward's story extends far further than that. Through his extremism, the young king, who had been so preoccupied with eradicating the power of the Catholic Church, actually brought to its strengthening. As a result of his persecution of moderate voices within the Protestant movement, English Protestantism had become controlled by extremists who were able to reject ordinary Christians rather than attract them. Many English Protestants were beginning to consider Catholicism as a sanctuary from the increasingly harsh demands of Edward's brand of Reformed religion by the time he passed away. This transformation occurred at the time of his death. Historians of the modern era have started to re-evaluate Edward's reign, and the picture that emerges is significantly more bleak than the conventional tale of a sickly lad. Court records and private correspondences depict a young man who was genuinely thrilled about persecution and exhibited alarming signs of relishing the misery of others. This young man was manipulated by ambitious mentors. The fact that Edward personally participated in the planning of executions and kept comprehensive records detailing the methods of torture lends credence to the notion that England was ruled for a period of 6 years by a person who can only be defined as a child psychopath with unrestricted authority. The metamorphosis of Edward from a child who was innocent to a brutal tyrant provides troubling insights into the corrupting influence of total power. Edward's full seclusion from normal human connections and his total conviction in his own supernatural authority came together to create a perfect storm of cruelty. This is in contrast to adult monarchs, who might at least maintain some capacity for empathy or political calculation. The young man who had never been told no, and who believed that everyone who disobeyed his will was physically committing a wicked act became capable of committing crimes that the violent Tudor age could not have imagined. An increasing number of contemporary sources indicate that Edward's courtiers were becoming increasingly alarmed by the actions of their young king, yet they felt powerless to prevent him. The same theory of divine right that justified his rule also made any dissent to his will akin to blasphemy. As a result, even his closest counselors were powerless to attempt to modify his increasingly radical policies. The young king had established a system in which even his most insignificant whims could be made into laws, and his growing preference for harsh behavior had no limit other than death itself. It is possible that the question of what would have occurred if Edward had lived to reach full age is the one that raises the most frightening anxiety. His plans for Protestant England included the installation of a permanent religious police force, the full elimination of Catholic aristocracy, and the creation of a surveillance state that would have watched every aspect of his people's private lives. He also intended for his subjects to be subject to a surveillance state. The young man who passed away in 1553 had already started putting these ideas into effect on a limited scale, and there is every reason to suppose that a more mature Edward VI would have established one of the most tyrannical regimes in the annals of history. The legacy of Edward VI stands as a warning that evil can originate from the most improbable circumstances, and that even the best of intentions can be tainted by the influence of unbridled power and religious zeal. The young king, who was convinced that he was able to save England's soul, came dangerously close to destroying the country's body, and his death may have been the greatest act of mercy that his reign could have presented to his countrymen. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of combining total authority with ideological certainty, particularly when it is in the hands of a person who is too young to comprehend the full repercussions of their actions. Additionally, the story of Edward sheds light on the perilous convergence of youth, power, and ideology and its implications. Edward's entire isolation and unwavering faith in his own righteousness made him capable of contemplating atrocities that even the most seasoned political operators found startling. This is in contrast to adult tyrants, who may be constrained by political calculation or personal attachments. Instead of playing with toys, he was preparing mass executions and religious purges, seeing human lives as expendable commodities in his pursuit of religious purity. He should have been playing with toys. It is also a demonstration of how education can become brainwashing when it is devoid of balance and human perspective, as the rule of the young king reveals. Edward's teachers had produced a great theological scholar, but a moral monster, someone who could develop sophisticated academic reasons for violence, but who had never learned fundamental human empathy. Edward's tutors had created a moral monster. It is important to note that his narrative serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of any educational system that places an emphasis on ideological purity rather than human decency. Ultimately, the brief reign of Edward VI is considered to be one of the most unsettling examples of power corrupting innocence throughout the course of history. The young man who was once considered Henry VIII's most prized heir eventually became a figure so terrifying that his own passing was hailed by the people who were under his rule. The fact that he went from being a sheltered child to a potential tyrant illustrates some unsettling realities about human nature and the special dangers that are posed by individuals who believe that their brutality serves a higher cause. Not only did the passing of Edward VI represent the end of a life, but it also signified the end of what could have been the darkest possible destiny for this country, England. It is fitting that the final misery of the child king, who was plagued with grief and consumed with hatred for his own family, serves as a fitting conclusion to a reign that had promised so much hope but delivered only fear. Inadvertently, Edward VI may have provided his greatest service to the England he claimed to love by passing away at a young age. He prevented England from experiencing the full blooming of his awful vision to the fullest extent possible.